Returnal has been out for an entire week now, and with all the new AAA goodness that it has brought to the rogue-type genre, the question is now being asked, is this better than Hades? Comparing these two games is no easy feat. While they both come from relatively small studios, Supergiant Games still makes very indie-like experiences, and Housemarque with Returnal was going for a more AAA feel. There has been some debate as to whether or not Returnal warranted its $70 price tag, but I think that Housemarque here did provide an experience that looks and feels premium. The overall experience of Hades, by contrast, was made to feel like an indie game. It had an illustrated-like graphic style, and the game loop overall was much shorter. Rather than continuing to compare these at a very high level, though, let's look at a few facets of these games and see exactly how they compare. First, let's take a look at the stories and the narratives. Traditionally, these games have very poor stories. All you really get usually is enough to get you into the game loop, and then once you're going, the story usually holds back and you just continue to grind through the dungeon over and over again. Hades was the first game to change this, and while Hades still had that same grindy loop where you would play the game over and over again, they managed to add in a storyline in between the different loops of the game that kept the player striving towards the end goal. A really fascinating piece of Hades is it didn't matter how many times you died in the dungeon. Whenever you came back to the main town, there was always new story to be experienced. Part of this had to do with how many characters there were in the game. It wasn't just the protagonist Zagreus and the antagonist Hades, there were all these other characters that were living and breathing within the storyline, and as you would stop between your runs, it might have been their storyline that was progressed, and it might have been the main storyline that was progressed, but there was always something new to be heard. This meant that while Hades may have been the first game to attempt bringing a real story into a rogue-type game, it also did a phenomenal job at doing it. The world felt alive, and all of the characters seemed to have their own ambitions and purpose within the world. You also, as a player, were drawn into Zagreus' mission, and you wanted to help him find his mother and rebel against Hades at the same time. Returnal's story executes much differently. You are alone in a desolate world where there are alien creatures attacking you, and the story is progressed through flashbacks and or hallucinations that the primary protagonist is having that unravels the story as you proceed through your dungeon there. This immediately puts Returnal at a disadvantage. There is no thriving world full of characters for you to experience and become intertwined with and further draw you in. Instead, it replaces that with a more mysterious vibe, and you find yourself asking questions as the story is presented to you, and you learn about each piece one at a time. Between these two approaches, I think that Hades has a little bit of an edge here simply because the subject matter allows them to have a much wider world with so many more characters that it allows it to have a deeper story overall. Returnal does do the mysterious thing fairly well, but there's only so much subject matter that you can put into a desolate world with a single protagonist. With Hades, if you're not complimenting its story, then I find that people are most often complimenting the weapon systems. So how do those compare between Hades and Returnal? In Hades, as many people know, you get 6 different weapons that are augmented as you play throughout the dungeon. One run with the same weapon may look very different than another run. This means that while there are only 6 different weapons, since they change so much, it ends up being this almost infinitely deep weapons system that is so well balanced. It really is a shining star of what makes Hades great. Returnal, by contrast, has taken a much more direct approach. You are offered a number of different guns that you find throughout the game, some of which are unlocked farther on in farther biomes, but the guns are meant to be fairly well balanced. Every single gun is built with the primary part of the gun, different stats, and then an alternate fire. Now, these elements of the gun that you picked up will not change over time, but you will find duplicates of the gun that you found that will have different stats, different levels, and most importantly, a different alternate fire. This is a completely different system than what Hades used, but the important bit when comparing it is that they both feel well balanced and that they both are effective no matter what weapon you have. In both games, there's going to be some player subjectivity, where various players will think that certain weapons are awful and certain weapons are way overpowered, but the point of the matter is that you'll have to learn how to use all of the weapons if you want to be successful in the game, and that in general, all of the weapons are fairly well balanced. One of the most important components of rogue-type games is the bosses. Both of these games were designed in a way that took this to heart. They have bigger-than-life bosses that you're going to have to fight multiple times before you're able to proceed through the game. In Hades, because of the design of the game loop, you are meant to fight the same bosses over and over again. There are 4 different worlds in the game with 4 separate bosses, and those 4 separate bosses will be repeated over and over again every single run of the game. At some point, some of the bosses do start to vary a little bit, but at its core, the bosses are mostly the same. Returnal uses a little bit different of approach of boss progression. Once you've beaten a boss, the game usually will give you a shortcut soon thereafter where you'll be able to circumvent that boss on follow-up attempts so that you'll be able to take shortcuts and proceed into the next biome directly. Because of the sheer size and length of the game, for Returnal, this is the right decision. The bosses are a little bit more difficult. It will take more attempts to learn their patterns and defeat them. But once you do, it would feel very cheap for the player to have to go back and fight those same bosses that were barely passable the first time you fight them. Comparing the two directly, again, is very difficult because of the way the implementation works between them. I do think that Returnal has a slight edge in this particular facet, simply because their bosses were more difficult, they took longer to fight, but then once you were able to complete the boss, you didn't have to fight that boss again. Hades, by contrast, had a little bit easier of bosses, and I found that as I played the game more and more, the boss experiences just kind of became a little bit more of a drag because I felt like I was doing the same thing over and over. This will be very subjective though, because some players are going to prefer a boss design that's slightly easier, but more importantly, bosses that you're going to repeat over and over again. I found that with Returnal, I liked the boss design better because it was more of a challenge at that moment, but then once it was done, and then I got to move on into the game and fight the next big boss. Finally, there's the game loop, and then just kind of overall the quality of life design of these two games. When Hades set out in its design, it was trying to make the best rogue-type game they could possibly make, and they looked at what had been successful in the past and decided that they wanted to do the best version of those things. The entire playthrough of Hades is about an hour long. Sure, you're going to have to do it plenty of times in order to reach the final ending of the game, but you don't really mind it so much because all the gameplay elements came together so nicely. The diversity of the game also plays into what makes Hades so enjoyable to go 1 hour after 1 hour, run after run through the game. You never really play the game the exact same way twice, so because of that, it doesn't feel so monotonous. In short, if I was to sum all of these elements up, what I would say is that Hades took a really well-designed recipe that we've been crafting over almost a decade at this point with roguelite type games, and then it just perfected it. They made everything optimal and everything feel so perfect that it came out to feel like a really great recipe. In contrast, Returnal is an uncharted territory. Returnal tried to make a game that was a AAA rogue-type game. And I actually had this feeling that a game like this was right around the corner when I played Hades. Hades opened up the ability for there to be a story in a roguelite game and really begged the question, could we throw more resources at this, add more fidelity, and make this game bigger? And the answer is yes. The first attempt of that would be Returnal, but the first attempt is going to end up being a little bit messy. Frankly, I think that Housemarque did a bang-up job on this game. For the very first AAA rogue-type game, you have to admit they did a pretty damn good job here. There are a number of issues, though, that come with trying to make a rogue-type game a AAA game. First of all, you have your length. With a AAA game, there's an expectation that the length of the game will be a certain level, and with Returnal, they've made it tens of hours. The way that they've done that is by padding the game in certain places of its game loop. For instance, once you beat the first biome and you have to move on to the second biome, in order to give yourself the best chances of success in the second biome, you have to rerun through the entire first biome. As you proceed through the game into the third and fourth biomes, this need to go back into old biomes and clean them out becomes more and more necessary, and you'll find yourself playing longer and longer bits of just grinding up your character to give you a shot at the new part of the game. The unfortunate problem that this causes is that can make a single run through the game 3-4 hours, maybe even more, depending on how much of the game you're cleaning out before you're entering the place that you haven't completed. To add insult to injury, at least at the time of launch for this game, there is no saving at all in the runs. So if your system is turned off or updates in any way, you will lose that run and have to start over from the very beginning. I don't know about you, but if I had been grinding for 3 hours or so and had to turn my game off before I was able to get to the part that was new to me, and then my game was reset for reasons that were not in my control, I'd be pretty pissed off. That has been the experience of some players, and I think that when they were designing the game and they decided that a run through the game is going to take multiple hours, that save is a prerequisite for quality of life for the players. When you get to the crux of the question, the reason this video exists, has Hades been dethroned as the greatest rogue type game ever? The answer's mostly no. Returnal is the pioneer of the AAA rogue type game, and I think that came with some bumps and bruises, particularly around quality of life, but I also think that the way that the game was structured with its subject matter, it also gave it a disadvantage when it came to story. By Zagreus and Hades having Greek mythology behind them, it was a really rich environment for a story-driven game. Returnal picked an isolated experience on a desolate planet, and there really isn't the same opportunity to drive a story home there. When you pair that with the growing pains that Returnal sees because it's the first AAA rogue-type game, it ends up at a little bit of a disadvantage. Hades was the culmination of a certain set of design elements and a certain set of technologies. Returnal is a new experience with a new set of rules, and I think another game is going to sneak up very soon after Returnal and do it much better and just blow everything out of the water. But I think in the end, Returnal is a top 3 rogue type game and doesn't knock Hades off of that throne. I'm sure this one's going to be pretty controversial, so make sure to leave a like down below. As always, thanks for hanging out with me, and until next time, this has been Pixel.